You're gonna present that Marx after growth thing, Anne?
I don't know. I'm doing a little something different today.
Okay. I saw that. I was like, oh, that looked interesting.
Oh, well, that's interesting too.
Frederic Jameson died. Oh, that's sad.
Yeah, 2 days ago, or 3 days ago now, I suppose. Um, all right. So live stream is on. Hello, everyone. Um, just putting up another link. All right. Fred Jameson died at the age of 90 a couple days ago. And so it was interesting to me just that people started posting in Twitter or X their favorite little thing by Jameson, and everyone wants to do their little memoriam, I suppose, and share their own memories. Mine is I'll what I'm going to do is read a few of these kinds of pieces that people saved as memoria, but also just to reflect on that Jameson is worth reading. He's not simply the guy who gives us postmodernism or postmodernism is the logic of capitalism, um, which is fine. It suggests an entire structural thing that goes to Althusser and a bunch of other stuff. There are also limitations, I would assert, in Jameson's thought, in that I would assert that he doesn't fully grasp certain other kinds of ideas or theories. And I'm not quite sure why he doesn't, and that may be another thing that I have to still read more Jameson. But it seemed to me never fully addressed to people like Badiou or Deleuze-Guattari. But that's just me. I sort of lost touch. But um, if there's anything I remember, it is that in the 1980s, I suggested that he look at the work of Derek Gregory and time geography. And so at the front end of his uh, postmodern stuff, he talks about cognitive mapping. And I think that he gets that from this little suggestion that that I made that, you really should look at this whole bunch of literature because I think it could reflect on um, Fred's interest in Henri Lefebvre, and the space of, sort of producing space. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so that's from, I don't know, 40 years ago. um, Jameson also helped me get my first article published. So that's the other thing. All right. Jameson argued that socialists today can revive utopian ideals by showing that change is, in fact, possible. Someone once said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. We can now revise that and witness the attempt to imagine capitalism by way of imagining the end of the world. And I think that's kind of, if anything, that Fred could really give us. It was this sense that uh, we can witness the attempt to imagine capitalism by way of imagining the end of the world. I included a couple of uh, sort of the usual end of the life type interview things. So I included a couple of those from YouTube, but I'm going to just read a couple of things that I think are interesting only because they're sort of cross-disciplinary reflections. They're things that I was interested in. I'm not as interested in the current sense in terms of the stuff that I'm interested in. So this is Jameson. I've spoken elsewhere of the turn towards a thematics of mechanical reproduction, of the way in which the autoreferentiality of much of postmodern art takes the form of a play with reproductive technology, that is, films, tapes, videos, computers, and the like, which is, to my mind, a degraded figure of the great multinational space that remains to be cognitively mapped. Fully as striking on another level is the omnipresence of the theme of paranoia as it expresses itself in a seemingly inexhaustible production of conspiracy plots of the most elaborate kinds. Conspiracy, one is tempted to say, is the poor person's cognitive mapping in the postmodern age. That's really a nice way to put that. It is a degraded figure of the total logic of late capital, a desperate attempt to represent the latter's system, whose failure is marked by its slippage into sheer theme and content. You know, if there's anything that sort of sums up all of Trumpism, that's pretty much it. Achieved cognitive mapping will be a matter of form, and I hope I have shown how it will be an integral part of socialist politics, although its own possibility may well be dependent on some prior political opening, which its task would then be to enlarge culturally. Still, even if we cannot imagine the productions of such an aesthetic, there may be nonetheless, as with the very idea of utopia itself, be something positive in the attempt to keep alive the possibility of imagining such a thing. So I think it's really important to maintain a certain way in which we think about the imaginary or an imaginary and its relationship to a historical, both a historical consciousness and a historical unconscious. And so these are important elements, and I commend to you Fred's work just simply because it's worth considering in the context of certain types of thought. And as I said, there are other elements of thought where, you know, the Jameson didn't go, but, you know, I mean, he, as we all are, products of our time. So I included a little thing on the contingency of cheese, the antinomies of realism. Included this other little thing, a kind of a celebration of Jameson at 90, et cetera, et cetera. And that's an hour and 40 minutes. What does need to be theorized about these propositions that otherwise will seem to lapse at once into the passive correspondence theory of aesthetics, which we sought to avoid, is the situation from which capitalism and realism simultaneously emerge. In a more general way, the relationship between art and its social context can be freed from inert conceptions of reflection by the proposition that the social context, including the history of forms themselves and the condition of the vernacular language, is to be grasped as the situation, that is, the situation, the problem, the dilemma, the contradiction, the question to which the work of art comes as an imaginary solution, resolution, or answer. Yet the situation of realism is a historically and dialectically unique one, which demands the clarification of an additional theoretical concept or slogan, namely that of cultural revolution in the most general sense. And there's a book on theory that I think is a reflection partially on Lacan, among others, and I think it integrates a whole bunch of things that he had been working on. The thing that most impressed me, if Fred was a mentor of mine, he's really not a mentor since I've never really studied with him, just read his work. And I was at a conference and it just amazed me that he was writing all the damn time. I mean, he took every little sort of time off. It was not spent, you know, sort of in leisure time so much as he was sitting writing. And that was, that just impressed me that he was constantly writing. And so a lot of these little pieces in this thing have to do with all kinds of other little thoughts about stuff. It's sort of a compendium of other things that he'd been working on in his earlier work. His dissertation was on Sartre. He's written on phenomenologists, et cetera. Structuralism was a big deal as well. Levi-Strauss, Barth, and Baudrillard, et cetera. And of course, Lacan, and Althusser. So, I mean, you know, he's the guy who actually knew Althusser. So this is all important stuff, as well as Derrida. So this is the integration of all those kinds of things. And then ultimately, of course, his interesting commentaries on the necessity of feminism, the essential components of feminism, and integrated with a variety of Derridian approaches, among others, Iraguirre, Julia Kristeva, etc. Foucault, of course. So while he does comment on Deleuze and Debord and all at Bolivar, Nancy, Rancière, all those people, the later work doesn't quite get into that. I think he does relative to his discussions of postmodernism, but later on, I'm not sure that he really fully engages sort of the theoretical text, and that's kind of where I guess his work, my interests diverge. I tended to be more interested in the kind of theoretical structural problems that if you're going to use a semiotic square, for example, you really have to engage what that really means to engage in that kind of diagrammatic approach to things, as Grandma approaches it. But anyway, it's just me. Yet put such an experience in the framework of the detective story, and everything changes. And he had an interest in popular culture stuff, like the detective story and science fiction. Yet put such an experience in the framework of the detective story, and everything changes. I learned that the man I saw does not even live in my building, that it was in reality opening the murdered woman's mailbox, not his own. And suddenly my attention flows back into neglected perception and sees it in renewed, heightened form without damaging its structure. Indeed, it is as if there are certain moments in life which are accessible only at the price of a lack of intellectual focus, like objects at the edge of my field of vision, which disappeared when I turned to stare at them head on. Proust felt this keenly, his whole aesthetic presupposing some absolute antagonism between spontaneity and self-consciousness. For Proust, we can only be sure that we have lived, we have perceived after the fact of the experience itself. For him, the deliberate, willful project to meet experience face to face in the present is always doomed to failure. In a minor way, the unique temporal structure of the best detective story is also a pretext, a more organizational framework for such isolated perception. So, without getting too heavily into that, it is this sort of the problem of the center and the periphery of one's field, foregrounding and backgrounding, the difference between the inductive and the deductive. All of those things are there in the detective story. All right. It is in this light that the well-known distinction between the atmosphere of American and English detective stories is to be understood. Gertrude Stein, in her lectures in America, sees the essential feature of English literature to be the tireless description of daily life, lived routine and continuity, in which possessions are daily counted up and evaluated, in which the basic structure is one of cycle and repetition. American life, American content, on the other hand, is a formless one, always to be reinvented, an uncharted wilderness in which the very notion of experience itself is perpetually called into question and revised, in which time is an indeterminate succession from which a few decisive, explosive, irrevocable instants stand out in relief. Hence, the murder in the Placid Village or in the fog-bound London club is read as the sign of a scandalous interpretation and a peaceful continuity, whereas the gangland violence of the American big city is felt as a secret destiny, a kind of nemesis lurking beneath the surface of hastily acquired fortunes, anarchic city growth, and impermanent private lives. Yet in both, the moment of violence, apparently central, is nothing but a diversion. The real function of the murder in the Quiet Village is for order to be felt more strongly, while the principal effect of the violence in the American detective story is to allow it to be experienced backwards in pure thought, without risks, as a contemplative spectacle which gives not so much the illusion of life, as the illusion that life has already been lived, that we have already had contact with the archaic sources of that experience of which Americans have always made a fetish. That's an interesting observation as well. Reification and utopia in mass culture. Now, these are all fragments from people who just, they're just posting in X or Twitter their favorite thing that they associate with Fred Jameson. It's no different than people at a funeral or at a funeral service giving their recollections or whatever. And I think that's probably one of the more interesting ways to approach Fred's life. The theory of mass culture or mass audience culture, commercial culture, popular culture, the culture industry, as it is variously known, has always tended to define its object against so-called high culture without reflecting on the objective status of this opposition. You can see that's already very Hegelian and materialist. As so often, positions in this field reduce themselves to two mirror images, which are essentially staged in terms of value. Thus, the familiar motif of elitism argues for the priority of mass culture on the grounds of the sheer numbers of people exposed to it. The pursuit of high or hermetic culture is then stigmatized as a status hobby of small groups of intellectuals. As its anti-intellectual thrust suggests, this essentially negative position has little theoretical content, but clearly responds to a deeply rooted conviction in American populism and articulates a widely based sense that high culture is an establishment phenomenon, irredeemably tainted by its association with institutions, in particular with the university. The value invoked is therefore a social one. It would be preferable to deal with TV programs, The Godfather or Jaws, rather than Wallace Stevens or Henry James, because the former clearly speak a cultural language meaningful to far wider strata of the population than what is socially represented by intellectuals. Populist radicals are, however, also intellectuals. So this position has suspicious overtones of the guilt trip. Meanwhile, it overlooks the antisocial and critical, negative, although generally not revolutionary, stance of much of the most important forms of modern art. Finally, it offers no method for reading even those cultural objects it valorizes, and has had little of interest to say about their content. I've touched on the preponderance of space over time in late capitalism. The political conclusion to draw from this development is plain, namely that in our time, all politics is about real estate. And this from the loftiest statecraft to the most petty maneuvering around local advantage. Postmodern politics is essentially a matter of land grabs on a local as well as global scale. Now, whether you think of the issue of Palestine or of gentrification and zoning in American small towns, it is that particular and imaginary thing called private property in land which is at stake. The land is not only an object of struggle between the classes, between rich and poor, it's their very existence and the separation between them. Capitalism began with the enclosure and with the occupation of the Aztec and Inca empires. And it is ending with foreclosure and dispossession, with homelessness on the individual as well as the collective level, and with the unemployment dictated by austerity and outsourcing, the abandonment of factories and rust belts. Whether you think of the settlements and the refugee camps, some of them lasting a whole lifetime, or of the politics of raw materials and extraction, whether you think of the dispossession of peasants to make way for industrial parks, or of ecology and the destruction of the rainforests, whether you think of the abstract legalities of federalism, citizenship, and immigration, or the politics of urban renewal and the growth of bidonvilles, favelas, and townships, not to speak of the great movements of the landless or of Occupy, et cetera, et cetera. There is a breathlessness about the shift from the normal object-oriented activity of the mind to such dialectical self-consciousness, something of the sickening shudder we feel in an elevator's fall or in the sudden dip in an airliner. That recalls us to our bodies, much as this recalls us to our mental positions as thinkers and observers. The shock, indeed, is basic and constitutive of the dialectic as such. Without this transformational moment, without this initial conscious transcendence of an older, more naive position, there can be no question of any genuinely dialectical coming to consciousness. But precisely because dialectical thinking depends so closely on the habitual everyday mode of thought, which it is called on to transcend, it can take a number of different and apparently contradictory forms. So it is that when common sense predominates and characterizes our normal everyday mental atmosphere, dialectical thinking presents itself as the perversely hair-splitting, as the over-elaborate and the over-subtle, reminding us that the simple is in reality only a simplification, and that the self-evident draws its force from hosts of buried presuppositions. When, on the other hand, after the fashion of intellectuals, we begin to work our way up through a series of abstractions, each one progressively further and further away from the real itself, pervaded as we do so by an uneasy suspicion that the whole teetering construction stands as a monument not to new laws of nature, but rather to the rules of some private mental hobby. Then dialectical thought comes as a brutal rupture, as a cutting of the knots that restores us suddenly to the grossest truths, to facts as unpleasantly common as common sense itself. Indeed, these two apparently antithetical effects of dialectical awareness largely correspond, as we shall see later, to the respective dialectics of Hegelianism and Marxism. So here's something, I'm not sure which one this is from. It might be from the Historical Unconscious. It is a vast and ill-lit basement, the basement allegory of history, Jameson's basement allegory of history. It is a vast and ill-lit basement, intersected by pipes of all sizes of various materials, and in various states of deterioration without obvious passageways, and obstructed by tanks and storage containers of all sizes, each one of which, pipes and tanks alike, sporting dials and glass panels of equal variety, whose registers, clocks, meters, thermometric pressure gauges, numerical scales, quadrants, warning lights, and calibrations are in constant surveillance by the innumerable historians in their white coats and checkboards, jostling one another as they jockey for a look or sneer at their neighbors. No one knows how many kinds of measurements are in play here, not even the antiquity of some of the devices, each of which registers the variable rates of different indicators, such as water pressure, temperature, instability, consumption, luxury goods, life expectancy, annual film production, salinity, ideology, average weight, average heat, church attendance, guns per family, and the rate of extinction of species. Those who've concluded that these tasks are meaningless sit against the wall in various states of fatigue. Others race frantically back and forth to invent a master statistic that might encompass all these random findings, while still others concentrate stubbornly on their own calculations and substitute their own algorithms, which may or may not have any relationship to those of their neighbors. None of them registers history directly, of course. It exists somewhere outside this basement or laboratory, and all the dials seem to record it in one way or another. You could certainly call it an absent cause or an untotalizable totality if you think it exists. But no one has ever seen anything but the gauges in their needles, the numbers in their rise and fall, which vary widely and require separate monitors. Despite this, there persists the occasional joint cooperative efforts, along with the most unsubstantiated generalizations and a tacit conviction, if not a mutual agreement, that there must be something or other out there. As we've seen, Marxism in general, and Jameson in particular, have a deep distrust of anything pretending to timeless or universal significance. And this may well be why Jameson never pauses to reflect on narrative as such. But in fact, many of his insights depend on the notion that narrative, once floated loose from its instantiation in novels or myths or epic poems, It's really not so much a literary form or structure as an epistemological category. Like the Kantian concepts of space and time, that is, narrative may be taken not as a feature of our experience, but as one of the abstract or empty coordinates within which we come to know the world, a contentless form that our perception imposes on the raw flux of reality, giving it, even as we perceive, the comprehensible order we call experience. This is not to make the conventional claim that we make up stories about the world to understand it, but the much more radical claim that the world comes to us in the shape of stories. As one can often get students to see how Kantian categories work by asking them to try to imagine the world without space and time, or in Wittgenstein's variation, to try to imagine a spatiotemporal object like a table outside space and time, one can grasp the full implications of what might be called the narratological claim by trying to think of the world as it would exist outside narrative. Since we're so used to thinking of stories as something disposable, something within the boundaries of the world, this does not at first sound difficult at all, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's William Dowling, the thing above, arguing that Jameson has shown that narrative is a necessary epistemological category. Show that anything that we try to substitute for a story is, on closer examination, like to be another sort of story. The exercise soon leads, in fact, out of the linguistic and cultural sphere and into the sciences, where physicists tell stories about subatomic particles. Bertrand Russell's point that electrons have histories depends on this. And where even mathematical proofs, with one step following another towards an inevitable conclusion, exhibit something of the dynamics of plot and closure. The serious challenge that has arisen within historiography in recent years to old-fashioned narrative history may thus be regarded not as an attempt to escape narrative itself, which would, on this account, be impossible, but simply to move from one narrative mode, kings, battles, riots, elections, etc., to another. The account of the Mediterranean world given by Braudel, with its long, slow, magnificent sweep of geological changes, trade routes, and the rest, is, as often enough been pointed out, no less a story than the histories it aimed to correct or replace, but simply a story on a different scale. And the same will be true of other annals historians, or in the United States and Britain, of the cliometricians who favor quantitative methods. This is why Jameson will be so singularly unembarrassed by the claim that Marx, in the guise of presenting a theory of history, was just telling a story, or that his story, under Hegel's inspiration, clearly exhibits a providential plot. Taking history seriously means accepting some story as the means of knowing anything at all. There's something different. That is, that this is to be grasped subjectively as well as objectively. The authors stress then again and again, not least by way of the image of Odysseus, whose resourcefulness presupposes equally extraordinary self-control. For the domination of the self is simultaneous with the domination of external nature. Even the most modest control over threatening forces in the outside world presupposes all the initial forms of psychic repression, whose inextricable relationship to civilization Freud posited in Civilization and Its Discontents. These are then also to be numbered among the forms and achievements of enlightenment, and can be observed recapitulated in children's discipline and pedagogy, or in that of the national cultures themselves, as in Norbert Elias's history. But it will be most appropriate to grasp this repression, this domination of inner nature, which may also, with Lacan, be called the construction of the subject in a somewhat different way as the transformation of the subject into an instrument and a weapon, a means. What remains of it as an end in itself, and we better think of this as the great utopia of aimless floating and gazing at the sky, as in M.M. sur l'eau, rather than the already highly repressed and disciplined Kantian imperative, is then little more than its continuing existence, or in other words, self-preservation always. In Adorno, the lack of violence, whose absence, if it were possible, even conceivable, would at once constitute utopia. The world almost unchanged, as he liked to say, following Benjamin on the Talmudic conception of the world transfigured by Messiah. Speculation on the consequences of just such a general removal of the need for a survival instinct leads us well beyond the bounds of Adorno's social life world and class style, or our own, and into a utopia of misfits and oddballs in which the constraints of uniformization and conformity have been removed, and human beings grow wild like plants in a state of nature. Not the beings of Thomas More, in whom sociality has been implanted by way of the miracle of the utopian text, but rather those of the opening of Altman's Popeye, who, no longer fettered by the constraints of a now oppressive sociality, blossom into the neurotics, compulsives, obsessives, paranoids, and schizophrenics whom our society considers sick, but who, in a world of true freedom, may make up the flora and fauna of human nature itself. No less seductive is fascism, as Dan Forrest pointedly reminds me on the occasion of Starship Troopers and its seeming dramatization of my American utopia. I come upon the appropriate aphorisms of Heraclitus. Sea is purest and most unclean water. For fish, drinkable and life-saving. For humans, undrinkable and deadly. Collectivity can certainly be a deadly slogan, but it is a mistake to think that the function of ideological analysis is imminently to detect the political valence of a text or idea. Only political practice can do that. The function of ideological analysis is structural, to show the inner construction of the text and the multiple ways, for good or ill, that it can be used. My purpose in an American utopia was not to resolve the internal contradictions of some concept of the collective which remains to be invented. Rather, it was to show how the positive functions of the Constitution could be preserved by way of an organization that cuts across state boundaries in an unexpected way, thereby producing a stereoscopic image of dual power. As for that excellent film called Starship Troopers, a sly Dutch glimpse of America, I doubt if anyone, even our local fascists, will be converted by it, save for the countercultural bits duly noted in the essay. When Deleuzeism appeared, it was part of a breaking of a wave in Deleuze and Guattari studies. It really was the case that after Deleuzeism, the deluge, in the years that followed, my decision of a decade earlier to write a dissertation on Deleuze and Guattari began to seem very canny indeed, as dozens upon dozens of books about their work were published in practically every field of the humanities and social sciences. Ironically, the least influenced field in this regard is philosophy, which seems to regard them as Johnny-come-latelys, if not at all. I'll never forget being told by the head of the philosophy department of the University of Western Australia that they didn't read any French philosophers more recent than Descartes. This was in 1996, when I was trying to get interdepartmental support for a Deleuze conference I was organizing in the English department. The conference went ahead without philosophy support, and that has largely been the pattern all over the world. Philosophy departments everywhere have tended to ignore two of the most exciting philosophical thinkers of the 20th century. It was in this regard fitting that Frederic Jameson was the keynote speaker, although many didn't think so at the time, because it was the comparativists like him, not the philosophers, who did the hard work of bringing Deleuze and Guattari's work to the people. The evidence is there in the list above, with the exception of Goodchild, who came to Deleuze and Guattari via religious studies. All the others are comparative literature scholars. There's a little reminiscence, I suppose. I'm not sure it's an obituary, but there is something in Jacobin last year that talks about Jameson, and the little note there that I began this with, arguing that socialists today can revive utopian ideals by showing that change is, in fact, possible. This is no different than the 19th century. And I close with a little diagram here on a simple cycle of financial instability, which sort of fits what we're looking at relative to Marx and Michael Hudson. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. Tomorrow we'll do, I think, we'll finish up chapter 12 of Hudson, probably move to 13, I think. and we'll go on to other things. And I apologize if this was a little disruptive, um, but I urge you to read stuff at least about Jameson to see his kind of position. On the one hand, being sort of a gadfly about postmodernism during a period when you had all of these French thinkers running around, and Jameson is a French scholar, um, albeit an American, was busy, trying to weave all these things together, and that's kind of interesting to note that. And I think that was his place in history. It was the 1980s. It was the moment when you could get postmodern architecture and postmodern literature and postmodern art, whatever that might be, all sort of working at the same time. And that was a very, I think, interesting and vital time that has yet to be sort of analyzed more critically. Let's just put it that way. Okay, that's all I have to say. Is other people have things to say?
Well, I really like this idea of the story. All these pieces are sort of, you know, well, not totally disparate, but I'm sort of struggling to bring them all together right now. But that idea of life as a story really seems intuitive to me.
Yes. It's that uh, the fun version of that is the one with the Rick and Morty episode where they're on the narrative train. You recall that one?
No, the
They're
narrative
on.
train, it's an actual train they're on.
Oh, that's right. It's a train, and they're trying to get from car to car, get to the engine. It's sort of a reflection on Snowpiercer and a bunch of other things, I'm sure. But it also is because what's it? The Harmon, is obsessed with narrative form, and well, his interest is myth or its reflection in cultural texts, like writing TV programs or whatever. But it's a whole episode. They're on this narrative train, and it has structural things, and they keep changing the plot, and um, it has, the kind of a reflection on narrative, and I really like it. It's kind of, something one should show to literature students. But anyway, um, that's by way of making an analogy to show that this is not a difficult topic. That is, you can make cartoons about it.
Oh, speaking of analogies, I want to explore that other one too, the basement, with all the like the meters and gauges and stuff. That sounds really cool.
Well, yeah, we don't want to get too far into it, but if you talk about postmodern architecture, for example, I guess Norman Foster's architecture or other stuff, the Centre Pompidou, you have certain type of architecture which actually exposes all the pipes and gizmos
Oh yeah, yeah, like
that
puts
make
it
a
on the
modern building.
outside.
That's right. You put it all on the outside of the building instead of on the inside of the building where it was before. And so, the first versions that, of course, are how remarkable it was. I remember the first time they put an outside a glass elevator in San Francisco. It only went up 3 stories, but it was kind of cool. Um, I mean, it was modernity at its height. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so no different than this is the Beverly Center in LA. It is a reflection on the Pompidou Center, but it's really a bad version of it. But anyway, that we digress. Um, you put the escalator on the outside of the building, in other words.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool that you got to, I guess,
I spent a
interact with this
little,
guy.
well, it's a little time, and it's the usual academic incestuousness, right? He invited me for a lecture, so I had to give a lecture over in the French department at USC when I was at UCLA, and then of course I got in a fight with somebody there that I was being unfair to the postmodernists, and I didn't want to get in a fight with kind of important people in the audience, but whatever.
Wow.
and I made the obtuse version comment that Steve Martin's L.A. Story was really kind of a classic. It had all the classic elements of a postmodern text because you have the freeway condition sign, the digital freeway condition sign, having a conversation with Steve Martin. You recall that, right? From
Right, vaguely, yeah. Now I'm sort of
pulls
coming
off the
back to it.
freeway, and then he has this sort of conversation with the thing that gives you the status or conditions of the highway
The
ahead.
traffic, yeah, and it's speaking to him, right?
So
Well, that doesn't seem obtuse to me at all.
no, but I made some comment about that it was kind of a bogus kind of branding, that it was simply more capitalism, and I got in trouble with a whole bunch of people. So
Oh, screw them.
yeah, well, they had their own issues, but anyway. On the other hand, never meet your heroes. Oh, thank you, Joe. The years of Jameson. That's I mean, there's a point at which when you become a famous academic, that you just live in this totally different world. I mean, let's see, got his PhD at Yale, got to teach at Harvard, didn't like Harvard, went to Yale, but was unhappy there because he just felt too isolated. Whatever. Um, and I think he taught at UC San Diego for a while, among other places. But he finally wound up at Duke with an endowed chair and blah blah blah. He was one of those six-figure income Marxists, right?
Well, there's a story there, huh?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, well, anyway, it's a reflection on what's his name's books on academia. Anyway, okay, so I think that's all the yakking I should do. Let
Well, that was
me.
nice. Thank you.
I hope it was useful for folks.